The Assyrian Empire ruled the Near East for 300 years, and nobody wrote down the day it ended. It ended outside a provincial town in the north of Syria, in a siege that failed. At the end of a campaign, a pharaoh had marched 500 miles to fight. Nineveh had fallen 3 summers earlier. The largest city on earth, taken by a Babylonian and Median coalition and left, in the words of the men who did it, a ruin heap. That looked like the ending. Assyria had 1 more king and 2 more years. The heartland was already gone. Assur stormed, then Nimrud, then Nineveh itself. Not frontier towns, but the ceremonial and administrative core of the empire, taken inside 5 years. What was left of the court did not surrender. It went west. 200 miles up the Euphrates stood Harran, a provincial city on the Balik River, and that is where the survivors gathered and declared a king. On a map of Assyria at its height, Harran barely registers. A market town on a road, a long way from anywhere that mattered. By now it is the whole empire. It is the last place on earth still taking Assyrian orders. Everything east of the Euphrates answered to Babylon or to the Medes. The 2 of them had divided the body between them at Nineveh, and neither had any reason to stop at the river. Their king was called Ashur-uballit, the second of that name and the last. Babylonian scribes call him king of Assyria. Assyrian documents call him the crown prince. And out on the frontier, legal texts swear their oaths to the covenant of the crown prince, not of the king. Because an Assyrian king was not simply proclaimed. He was made king at Assur by the god Assur, in a ritual 1,000 years old. And Assur was rubble. The ceremony required a city that no longer existed, so they crowned him at Harran instead, in the temple of the moon god Sin. Harran was not a hiding place. It stood on the Balik, a short march north of the Euphrates crossings, on the road running west out of Mesopotamia, and it had been sacred to the moon god for longer than Assyria had been an empire. A king who could not be crowned at Assur could at least be crowned somewhere older. It was also the last hinge in a chain. From Harran the road ran down to Carchemish and the river crossings. Across the river lay Syria, and past Syria, Egypt. Everything Ashur-uballit had left depended on that road staying open, because the only help still coming was going to come along it. Egypt had spent a century as Assyria's enemy. Esarhaddon invaded it. Ashurbanipal beat it and sacked Thebes. Now Egypt was the only power on earth still fighting for Assyria's survival, not out of affection, but because a broken Assyria was a buffer, and a victorious Babylon would be a neighbor. In the spring of 610 BC, Nabopolassar mustered the Babylonian army and marched north. He did not come alone. Down out of the Zagros came the Medes, whom the chronicle calls the Manda, the horde from the mountains, an old phrase and a deliberately vague one. They moved up the Tigris and then turned west, and by late in the campaigning season both armies stood in front of Harran. Ashur-uballit had a few thousand men and an Egyptian contingent. What had arrived to face him was the coalition that took Nineveh, intact, and this time reinforced. The Medes had come south for plunder 4 years earlier and stayed to finish the job. Their king, Cyaxares, had been fighting Assyria for a generation, and Harran was the last Assyrian thing left standing. And then the chronicle does something strange for the fall of a capital. It does not describe an assault at all. It describes an evacuation. The Babylonians entered the city, took it, and left a garrison inside. And that garrison is why the following year goes the way it does. Ashur-uballit crossed the Euphrates westward with whatever he still commanded. He held no Assyrian city now. He was in Syria, in country that had never been his to govern, a king in the sense that some scribes called him one. Behind him, Nabopolassar wintered, and the Medes went home with the loot. For 100 miles ahead of him was the only army on earth still willing to march for Assyria. Psamtik I had propped Assyria up for years with money and men, quietly, because a buffer is cheaper than a war. His son Necho stopped being quiet about it. He took the field himself, the pharaoh in person, not a general with an expeditionary force, and marched for the Euphrates. The road out of Egypt ran up the coastal plain and then had to turn inland. The Carmel Ridge comes down almost to the sea, and the only good way through it is a narrow defile onto the plain beyond. Egyptian armies had been using that defile for 800 years. The plain on the far side is wide and flat and famous, and the town that holds the mouth of the pass is Megiddo. Necho came up that road in the summer of 609, moving fast, with a river crossing 400 miles ahead of him and no time in his schedule for an argument in Palestine. Judah sat astride that road. It had spent most of the previous century as an Assyrian vassal. It had recently stopped paying, and its king had spent his reign pulling the country back out of the Assyrian orbit. This is the same pass, 848 years before Necho rode into it. An Egyptian army under Thutmose III came through the identical defile and caught a Canaanite coalition drawn up in front of the same town. Same ground, different century, and this time there was somebody waiting in it. Josiah, king of Judah, brought his army north and put it across the road. Why he did that is one of the genuinely open questions of the period. Judah was small and Egypt was not, and no source explains the decision. They only agree about the result. The ground gives an intercepting army one advantage and one only. The defile is narrow enough that numbers stop counting until you are through it. Thutmose had understood that. So it seems, did Josiah. Josiah went out to meet Necho, and Josiah died. Where he died depends on the account. Kings has him killed at Megiddo the moment Necho saw him, in one flat sentence. Chronicles gives a whole scene. Josiah in disguise, hit by archers, carried home to die in Jerusalem. Both are scripture. They do not match. The famous problem with that verse is not where Josiah died. It is one preposition. For most of 2,000 years the line was read as Necho going up against the king of Assyria, which makes Josiah a small king bravely blocking an invader on his way to attack a shared enemy. It is a clean story, and the Hebrew permits it. The Hebrew also permits the opposite, and the chronicle decides it. Necho was not marching against Assyria. He was the relief column, riding to a siege he was going to lose. Josiah did not die stopping an enemy of Assyria. He died in the road in front of Assyria's last hope, and nobody understood that until a broken tablet was dug out of the ground and read. Judah was an Egyptian vassal within 3 months, under a king Necho chose. Necho reached the Euphrates and crossed at Carchemish, and Carchemish is worth remembering, because he garrisons it and holds it for the next 4 years. Ashur-uballit crossed with him. The last king of Assyria re-entered his own territory as a guest in a foreign army, to besiege a city that had been his capital 18 months before. From the crossing the road ran east across open country to Harran, and everything Assyria still had in the world went up it. They came up to the walls around June and settled in. The odds looked good. They outnumbered the defenders. They had the Pharaoh of Egypt present in person, and the enemy was not a field army but a garrison holding a city Babylon had owned for barely a year. But a garrison behind a wall does not have to win. It only has to not lose. And Harran had been fortified by an empire that understood siege work better than anyone then alive. Through June, through July, through August, the attacks went in and the wall stayed up. Necho had no siege train worth the name that far from home, and the longer the summer ran the worse his position became. An army sitting still in hostile country eats its own supply line, and Nabopolassar was somewhere south of him with the field army coming. Ulyalu falls in late August. For months in front of a garrisoned town, by the combined strength of Egypt and everything Assyria had left, and the chronicle does not record a single casualty or a single assault. It records the outcome and moves on. They lifted the siege and went back over the river. Nabopolassar was coming north again with the main army, and the coalition had lost nothing in the exchange it could not replace. Necho fell back on Carchemish and stayed there, holding the crossing and running Syria from it. Ashur-uballit went with him, or did not. The record simply stops carrying him. He is never mentioned again in any Babylonian text, alive or dead. Somewhere on this road, in the late summer, the Assyrian Empire stops. Babylon reoccupied Harran and kept it. Within a few years the Euphrates was the frontier between Babylon and the Pharaoh, and the war moved down to the crossings. And that is the end of it, not the fall of Harran, which had already happened a year earlier, without a fight. This is the last appearance of an Assyrian army in any record anywhere on Earth. The tablet runs on into an 18th year, breaks into gaps, and ashur-uballit is simply not in it. 3 centuries of Assyrian supremacy, and no death seen for any of it. No last stand on a wall, no king in chains through Babylon, no palace burning with the family inside. All of that had already happened 3 years earlier, at Nineveh, to a different man. A state that had given orders from the Nile to the Zagros stops turning up in other people's paperwork, and no one records the moment. The name lasts longer than the thing. Assyria survives as a region on a map, and eventually as a story the Greeks get badly wrong. But the empire itself is finished in the late summer, outside a provincial town, in a siege nobody bothered to describe. Necho held Carchemish for 4 years and ran Syria from it, which is more than Assyria had managed at the end. Then Nabopolassar, old and ill, stopped campaigning and sent his son north in his place. Next time, Carchemish, the battle that ended Egypt's empire in Asia and made the reputation of a crown prince named Nebuchadnezzar.